Okay, so welcome back to day 2 of web apps and data analysis in RShiny. Yesterday we went over the basics of R, and today we're going to be applying those skills to creating your very first app in RShiny. And I'm going to be teaching you the main components of creating your own user interface. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. Okay, so now I'm going to show you an example of an app I've created. Do you see the shared screen? Okay, cool. It'd be great if you give a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So this is one of the apps just developed earlier today, and you're going to actually be recreating this app in the workshop. So this is a standard calculator app where you can type in numbers, and when you press compute, it computes the result of the calculator. And there's some other calculators that you might be able to implement. So now let's open up RStudio and see how we can create this app. Okay, so here you see the code. Here on the left, you see the code in RStudio. And on the right is the app that is rendered from this code in this script. Okay, so first of all, what is an app, and what are the kinds of apps that we're going to be creating? So I'm sure all of you have heard of apps, especially on your smartphone. Usually we think of apps as games or as social media platforms, but in its most basic form, an app can be any computer program or anything written from a computer code that allows a user to do something. And this simple example that I just showed with the calculator serves as an app because it was written from this code and allows the user to compute things. So here in this app, it contains the most basic components of an app that allows you. This app is pretty boring. Pretty much you can click a button and it says this button has been clicked. But it's important to learn from this basic boring app because it gives you the building blocks to start creating more complex apps.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, but I'm late. Can you please tell me what you guys were talking about, like briefly, please?
Yeah. We're just talking about apps.
App?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're just yeah. So we're just talking about apps. So today we're going to create apps.
App? Apps? Like APPS apps?
Yeah, like the games you find on your app store, on your phone. Okay, so I was saying, so today we're going to create apps. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you the basic tools you need to create your first app. So notice this app. Let's go through the different components of the app. So first we have the user interface. The user interface is what you see here displayed. So within the user interface, you see all these different components. For example, you have a header here with the title. You have a sidebar. And then you have all these little widgets here and outputs. For example, you have a box. You have this text box. You have this slider. You have these buttons. And each of these widgets here corresponds to an object that we're going to write in RShiny. So for example, this header right here, this header, can
you the record for the meeting after class or something?
Yeah. Okay. So, so for example, this header right here, it's contained in this header object right here. And for example, this sidebar here is created in this sidebar object right here. So now, some other components you need to code up your first app. So here all is the user interface. This is the static elements that are displayed directly on here. And then in order to create a dynamic app that is interactive with the user, you have to write server functions. Which allow the user to interact with the elements here to create a dynamic app. So for example, when we click this button, a text pops up that says this button has been clicked. And that is because we wrote a server function that handles this event. Okay. And finally, we need a line of code that runs the app. So this line of code runs the app right here. So notice that this app is run. It's run locally on a server here called HTTP 127 blah blah blah. This is on a local server. If you want to publish your app online, you can click this button here. Put some instructions in the worksheet in the workshop problems. But if you want to load your app locally here, just click this button. Or on a Mac, you can click the shortcut Command-Shift-S.
I can see. What button is it?
Can you see my mouse?
Is there install, but I don't see install.
Do you see my mouse pointer?
I see it.
Yeah, so here. Yeah, so here, this button runs the app.
You need anything to run the app?
Yeah, this button runs the app.
Do we need to download anything?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
It's asking.
Okay, so that's how you run the app locally on your computer. So now we're gonna start from scratch, and we're gonna. Okay, so now we're gonna run an app locally. Okay, so here's a blank app. Notice all we have right now is a header. Right here at the top of the screen, we have a sidebar on the side. Yeah, I'm gonna make this window a little smaller so you can see. And we have a body right here. This is all the information on the body. Okay, so to start adding let's start adding some user elements to the user interface. Okay, so first we're going to add a title to our header. So when we want to add elements to the user interface, to the app itself, we add them as parameters into the header function, or wherever you want to add them. So think of these as characteristics. So right now we have a plain header, and if we want to create a header with the title, we specify a title as the type of header. So we type title, and then title equals title here, and then when I redeploy the app, you see the title here on the top. And then we can also make this title bigger by specifying the title width, and this makes the title bigger. Okay. Yeah. So notice these are characteristics or parameters into the header function. But if we have hundreds of parameters or characteristics, it might get long to write them all in one line. So you can split them onto multiple lines, and R will automatically compile all this information as one object. So we're going to separate these onto separate lines. And notice how this is different from a function in that the code inside here is not run line by line. These are parameters into the header function. So you have to have commas after each parameters. And yeah, so big tip, if you're having an error, usually it's because you forgot a comma between your parameters. So always make sure you have commas between these parameters. Okay, so now we have a title here. Now in the sidebar, we want it to be enabled. So, or if we want it to be disabled, we can say disable equals true. And now it's gone. Or disable equals false. And now it's back. And then we want some text. We say here, sidebar, we can add it as a parameter. And now we can see the sidebar is right here. Text is right here in the sidebar. And if you want to specify the type of text, you can put it in another function with h, so like h3. And if you put this text into h3, it makes it slightly bigger. And for those of you who've done previous web development in HTML or CSS, you might recognize these h tags h1, h2, h3, h4, h5 specifies the size of the text. So if you want it bigger, you can make the number smaller. That's h1. If you want it smaller, you can change the number on the h tag. Okay, so that's a sidebar. And now we're going to go over here to the body. And now we're going to start adding parameters to the body. So let's quickly talk about the layout of the body. So if you have a lot of different text, you might want to organize it into different sections. Like you might want to have a text exactly right here, a text over here, a text down here. So what I like to do is think about this body as having invisible grid lines. So you can have invisible row lines, which specify which row you want the text to be in, and then which columns you want the text to be in. You can also create boxes. So the first one we're going to do is create a box. Here's a box. And then within the box, first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the width. It's a number from 1 to 12. Okay, so now we set a width, a box with a width of 12, which means it covers the whole screen. And then we're going to add some text. And now notice here's our text rendered inside the box because we put the text inside the box, which is inside the body. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how these rows and columns work. So now to start creating other elements, we're going to create a row first. And within that row, we're going to create two columns. And remember, make sure to add commas between each argument. Okay, so now we're going to add some text. Row 1, column 1, H4, column 2, and make sure to set the width of the column. Okay, and now we see our rows and our columns. So what do we do here? We made a new fluid row here within this box, and within the row, we added two columns. We added a column here and a column here. We set the width of the columns to be 6, which is half of 12, so it's half of the length of the box. And then we put the corresponding text within the row and the column. And we can create another row by copying this down here. And this is row 2. This is row 2, column 1, column 2. And that's basic display layouts. So you can insert text and widgets and position them close to where you want them to be positioned. Okay, next what we can do is we can add widgets. So I'm gonna quickly go back to the other app for a second. Okay, so we just created the sidebar with the header and a box up here at the top. And now we're gonna create some widgets, some text box and some sliders and some buttons into the body. Okay, so now going back to our blank template app. Now we're gonna go here and start writing some widgets. We don't want them to be inside the box, so we're not gonna put the widgets inside the box. We're going to put it parallel to the box, so right after the box, add a comma and add a new widget. So we're gonna create a fluid row here. Actually, we're going to create a fluid row here and two columns. So here I just copied over the text from the top. But in here, we're going to say column 1, widgets, input, widgets, and column 2. Outputs. Okay, so here, again, I just did some basic display layout where I created a row after this box. And then within this row, I put two columns. Imagine there's two column lines. The first column goes here, and the second column goes here. And within each column, I put the text corresponding to the column. Okay, so now we want to put the widgets inside this column. So we're going to stick our widget objects inside of this column. Okay, so after this, we're going to add some widgets. So let's see, the first type of widget we're going to add is a text input. Okay, so text input, first you need an input ID and a label, which I'm just gonna write, and then right after you'll see what these do. So we're gonna call this input text, and we're gonna say the label is text box. Okay, and now you see here, I created a text input object in this column, under this row, inside the body. Okay, so now we have a text box. And so inside the text input object, you have to specify an input ID and a label. So the label is exactly what it sounds like. It's a label for this box that you see explicitly on the app itself as part of the user interface. The input ID is also named for the text box, but it's a little more subtle because this input ID is not displayed anywhere on this on the app. Whereas the label is directly naming the object inside the app. The input ID is how you refer to this object. So later, if we want to get the value inside, if we write an input and we want to get the value inside this box, we're going to refer to this value by referring to the ID of this object later in the server function, as you'll see later. But for now, we're just going to create these elements, and I'll show you how to display them on the app. Okay, so next one I'm going to create is a numeric input. And numeric input is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a text input, except it only accepts numbers. So we're going to set the input ID to input numeric. And note that these input IDs and these labels, they just have to be, they're not any special names. You can name them whatever you want. We're going to say the label is a numeric input. And then we also have to set a value. Okay, so here's a numeric input. It's labeled numeric input as we specified here. And then we put the ID of this object as input numeric. So in the future, if we want to get the value inside this numeric input object, we're going to reference it by its input ID called input numeric. And then also we also have to specify a value. We're going to specify a value of 0, which is the default value when you open up the app. Okay, so next what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a slider input. Okay, slider input, I'm going to call this input slider, label. This one has, as you can see in the yellow text up above, the slider input has many more characteristics or parameters that specify the type of slider that you want. So for example, we have to specify the minimum value, the maximum value, the default value that the slider is set at. And then, okay, so we can set all these other parameters here. But actually what R does is I guess it's pretty unique in that you don't actually have to specify all the possible parameters that you could. You just need to specify the necessary ones that you want to display in your app. So for example, if we wanted to make this slider more descriptive, more detailed or fancy, we could add more parameters, but this is the bare minimum of all that we need to add. So it's labeled slider input. It has a minimum of 0, maximum of 10, and a default value of 5. Okay. Great. Next, we're going to add a checkbox. Checkbox input, checkbox group input. A checkbox group input. We're going to call this input checkbox. Label checkbox. And then we have to have some choices for the checkboxes. So we're going to say, we're just going to call the choices of the checkbox choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. But in R, anytime you specify a list of something, you put it in a vector. So we want to specify 3 choices for this checkbox. So we're going to put 3 choices into the vector. Choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. Okay, and here is our checkbox. Checkbox group with the input ID, the label here, and here's the list of choices that we have. We can also specify some more parameters, such as selected is choice 1, which is the default selected value. We can also make it inline. And that makes all of the choices in this line. Okay. Yeah, so I think you're starting to get the point of how to create these widgets. The last 2 I'm going to create are radio buttons and then just regular buttons. Okay, so radio buttons are similar to checkboxes. They're those little multiple choice buttons that you might see on text, on tests. We're going to specify choices. I'm just going to specify 2 choices. We're going to say inline equals true. Ooh, oops. I forgot a parenthesis there. Ooh. Okay, let's see. Here. Oh, I forgot a comma after this parameter. Okay, great. And now we see we have these radio buttons. Okay, so the last element we're going to add is just a standard button. So that's with the function action button. I'm going to label that button. And the ID is going to be button. The labels can be click me. And then I'm going to create another one that says unclick me, which okay, and then if I wanted these 2 buttons to be equally spaced within this column, I can put them into a split layout. And now they're equally spaced within this column. Okay, so now we have our whole unit as user interface, but as we can see, there are no server functions, so it's kind of boring. So when we click buttons or we move the slider, nothing happens. That's because we haven't told the app to do anything when we click these buttons. So that is where the server function comes in. Okay, so in the server function, what we're going to do is we're going to type observe event, and then within observe event, we're going to put button and write the syntax like this. Okay, so what this does, so let's go through this whole process of what the server function does. So what we want to happen is we want when the user clicks the button, this button, a message prompts right here. Okay, so first thing we want to do is, oh, actually, wait 1 sec. Let me go back and create an output. Okay, so what we want to happen is we want to create some dynamically rendered text. So right now we have static text right here with column 2 outputs. So this is static in that whenever you click any buttons or change anything, it's never going to change. So if you want something that a piece of text that could change, you write UI output. And similar to the input ID, you specify an output ID. I'm going to call it button text. And so there's a text object right here that you specify by button a text, the output ID. And then in the server function, we're going to write a function that when you click this button, it references this output ID button text and changes the text inside here to render the text like this button has been clicked. So now we're going to go down here to the server function, and we're going to type observe event and input button. So this parameter right here specifies what you want, what change the user is making to start this event. So in this case, the user is clicking this button in order to cause the event that renders this text here. So in this case, we want this observe event to happen when the button changes. And how do we know that it was called button? Well, if we go back up here to the button object, we set the input ID as button. It's called button, and this is called button here. So when we click this button, it's gonna call this function and call all the functions that are within this observe event. So what we want to do is say output ID output button text, and we want to assign it. We want to assign it a message. This button has been clicked. So now when we click this button, it outputs this message, this button has been clicked. And we reset the app, and we restart the app, it defaults to no message. Okay, so let's go through this whole process of how we get to when the user clicks the button that the text comes up. Okay, so when the user clicks the button, labeled button by the input ID, when the user clicks this button, it calls this observe event function, and we told it to call this function when when the user hits the button. And then inside this button function, we're going to call the text object. So this text object right here is called button text. And right now it's a blank string, so you can't see anything. But we're going to assign it a message, this button has been clicked. And to assign it that in the server function, you call it render UI. And this is output button text because that is the output ID that you set here. Okay, so now we'll do a similar thing with the unclick me button. So we want to observe event. And this time we want this event to call when we hit the unclick me button, which is specified here by the input ID called unbutton. So unbutton. I'm going to put these curly braces. And when we click unbutton, we want this message to change. So we want the output, the button text. We want to render UI. This button has been unclicked. So now when we click this unclick button, click the button, renders this text. When we click unbutton, unclick the unbutton, the unclick me button, which is called unbutton. It calls this server function and changes this text to this message. Okay, so we can also call observe event functions on other objects. So for example, say we want the value of the value inside this text to be rendered on the right here as well. So when we type in like hello world, we want hello world to also appear on the right. So first what we're going to do is create a UI output this creates a new piece of dynamic text. I'm just going to call it text output. Okay. So now we're going to create a server function that observes the event. Observes the event when the user types something in here. So the catalyst for the event is this text box, which we called input text. Input text. Okay, now we're going to add these curly braces. And now first we're going to say output. We want output. Which output text do we want? Well, we just called it text output. So we're going to say output text output render UI. And for now, I'm just going to say hello world. So now when I type in something here, it should type in hello world. Unfortunately, it didn't show very clearly, but basically what's supposed to happen is when you type a value in here, it outputs just, right now, it just outputs hello world. Okay, so if we want the value specifically inside this function, we need to find the value inside this function. So what we can do, the value inside this function is known by its input ID again. So input $input text is where the value of inside this text box is stored. So instead of saying we want to render hello world, we want to run the value inside input text. And why is it input text? Because that's the input ID that we called up here. Okay, so now when we type in something here, it outputs the message in here. So let's go through the whole process of how this works. So when we type in something here into this text box, it calls this observe event function, and the input ID for this object is called input text. So that's why we called it input text. And what it does is it outputs a text message known as text output right here, text output under this column. And what the message we're rendering to it is the input text within here, input text. So we say hello world, it should be hello world. And now when we click the button, also, it should say the button has been clicked. So now if we look at the layout of how we laid it all out in the user interface, on here, we have one column with all the widgets. We have one column with all the outputs. And on the outputs, we have this static text called outputs, and then we have button text and text output, which respond to the user when you click it. Okay, well, okay, so this might seem quite pointless. If you're trying to, like, this app seems quite pointless in that you just click a button and it says this button has been clicked. But you can apply these principles in any app to create pretty much anything that involves buttons and text inputs and outputs. So now what we're going to do is start to create this calculator function. So what I'm going to do is now go to this calculator app. Okay, so this is what we're going to start to create, a standard calculator. When you go input 5 and specify the operation, 5 plus 3, it should be 8. Great. So now I'm just going to start from this blank template. So first thing we have to do is specify specify a title in the header. Title equals calculator by Lucas Powell. And it's not big enough, so we're going to specify the title width as longer here. And now we're going to specify stuff in the sidebar. So actually, we don't want a sidebar, so I'm going to say disable equals true. Okay, and now the main part of the calculator is going to go into the body. So first we're going to do is create a box. Set the width equals 6. And now, okay, we set width equals 6. We're going to add a title to it. So just a h3 tag and say standard calculator. Standard calculator. Okay, and now under this, we're going to create an input and then option for operations, and then another input, and then we're going to hit compute. And then when you hit compute, it should display the message of the inputs and the result. Okay, so first what we're going to do is let's create an input text. Input ID is going to be input 1. The label is also going to be called input 1. Oh, sorry, it's text input. Okay, now I'm gonna copy that and create a second. I'm gonna create a second input, and then I'm also going to create an operation, some radio buttons that specify the operations. So input ID is the operation, label is operation, and then choices. Here, we're just going to have 2 choices, plus and minus, and we put them in vectors because R takes in a set of values as vectors. Okay, great. And now we want them all on the same line, and so we're going to put them into a split layout. Okay, so now all 3 widgets are in the same line. Okay, great. And now outside of the split layout, we want a button. So we're going to create an action button. It's going to be called compute, label compute. So right now when we hit compute, it doesn't do anything because we didn't write any server functions that tell it to do anything. So now we're going to have a text that says result. And then we also want a dynamic text, output ID. We want a dynamic text that tells the result what the result is based on these after you hit the compute. So we're going to create a dynamic text object called specified by UI output, and the output ID is going to be result. Okay, and now you don't see it right now because it has a default value of an empty string, but we're going to write a server function that responds to when the user hits this button. And then when the user hits this button, it's going to call the server function and change the value inside this dynamic text object and display result right here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is go down here and create a server function. Observe event. And we want to respond to this button. And this button is specified by the input ID compute. So we're going to input compute, comma, braces, and then what we want this to happen is to take this input, take this operation, take this input, and somehow combine it into a message. So ultimately, we want to return some kind of message in the output specified by the result. We want to render UI the result, right? We want to specify the result, but not the word result. We want to actually take these values and combine them. Okay, so we're going to set some variables. I'm going to call this input1, and we're going to set that as the value inside this input1 text, which was input $, and then the input ID of this text input, which is input1. And I'm going to make another variable. Actually, we're going to call them different because they don't have to be the same. We'll call this second input2. And then I'm going to say this operation is called input operation. And then we're going to paste together first, second, first, operation, second. Okay, so now when I write 5, 3, it writes 5 plus 3. And now what I want to do, is to actually compute the result. So what I'm going to do, instead of writing all the code to compute this value and combine it with this value and this value, I'm going to write a separate function outside of this and call it in here. So we're going to write a function called calculate, and it's going to take a function. It's going to take the first number, the second number, and an operation. And then if I want to say if operation is plus, right, then we're going to return the first value plus the second value. And if the operation is minus, we're going to return first minus second. Okay. And now we're going to call this function down here, down below, and put it into the server function. Okay, so now instead of, right now we have just the input values, but we also want to add the result. So we're going to add the result to its end by pasting it to the end of this. We're also going to paste equal signs and equal sign. And then we're going to say calculate. We want to paste the value when we get calculate first, second operation. And now when we type 5 plus 3, we get this error. And I should have addressed this, but that's because when we type 5 and 3 and we write it here, this 5 and this 3 are actually in here as strings, which means this is the character 5 and the character 3. So what we want to do, instead of calculating the characters 5 and 3, we're going to cast them to numbers. So remember from yesterday, so let's say the result, we want it to be calculate, not first, we want as.numeric first. And then we want as.numeric second, and then the operation. And then now here, we're going to paste in the result along with it. Result along with it. And now here we see, when we type in 5, specify the first input 5, specify the operation as plus, specify the second input as 3. The result we get is 5 plus 3 equals 8. and we change to minus, we get 5 minus 3 equals 2. And that's it for the calculator. So now what you're going to do in the workshop is we're going to go back to this calculator right here. And I gave you the code for this calculator that we just made right here in the lesson. And what your job is to do is to add more operations to this calculator. And if you finish that, implement these other types of calculators and write functions for that and so on. Yeah, so that's it from me. Karina, if you have anything else, otherwise I'm going to stop this recording.
Yeah, I pretty much have nothing else.